John Wayne Gacy, a name that once symbolized a friendly neighbor, a hardworking man, and a loving father.
John Gacy was a very successful businessman, active in a local Democratic Party, very well liked.
But behind the mask of this seemingly ordinary life, there lurked a darkness so chilling it would forever change the course of American criminal history.
Personally, I believe he's the worst animal who has existed during this century.
For years, Gacy deceived those closest to him, friends, family, and even his own community.
I was his sidekick. I was always following him. When we got the news, we were totally in disbelief.
He dressed as a clown, spreading laughter among children, while in the shadows, he was a sadistic serial killer.
He started posing as a clown, so he was called to various events. Even with my kids, they all loved when he was Pogo the Clown.
In the span of just 6 years, from 1972 to 1978, Gacy would brutally murder 33 young men and boys, burying many of them under his house, while others were discarded in nearby rivers.
We took a screwdriver into a little crack in the floor, and when we did, the whole floor lifted up.
But was John Wayne Gacy shaped by his traumatic upbringing, or was he born to kill? Even after his conviction, Gacy maintained his innocence, seeking a new trial just months before his execution in 1994.
People want to know the truth and the honesty of it. If they want to be convinced or brainwashed into what they believe, then fine, then go ahead and kill me. But vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, because you will have executed somebody that didn't commit the crime.
With overwhelming evidence against him, his final attempt to rewrite history raises the chilling question, who was John Wayne Gacy really?
I do not feel that a person who has committed so many crimes and hurt so many people should have anything available to him. Nothing whatsoever.
Join us as we explore the mind of one of America's most notorious killers and unravel the twisted layers of his life and crimes. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942. As a child, Gacy was close to his mother, but to his father, the overweight, unathletic boy was a constant disappointment, one that he showed no hesitation in expressing. Gacy's father regularly belittled him, calling him stupid, a mama's boy, and a sissy at school. Gacy struggled to meet expectations.
When he drank, he was almost like a different person. My dad struck all of his children all the time.
But the abuse at home would lay the foundation for a darkness that would emerge in the years to come, marking the beginning of a terrifying descent into a criminal world.
What I understand, he was physically abused by his father, and his father was often not available or was intoxicated. Clearly, those sorts of things have an impact on a person's development and the way they look at the world.
Despite his failures, young John Gacy began to earn a reputation as a braggart, telling elaborate stories and confidently talking his way out of trouble. At 11, Gacy was struck on the head by a swing, causing blackouts, but his father accused him of faking. By age 16, he began taking medication for a heart condition, further contributing to the perception that Gacy was weaker than his peers. When Gacy was 17, he left Chicago to start a new life. He moved to Las Vegas and took a job cleaning at a mortuary.
When John was about 17, him and my dad had a really big fight, and it had to do over a car which John had saved for and bought. He took off. We did not know where he was. My mom finally got my dad to get an investigator, and they found he was in Vegas.
The work was lonely and low-paying, with Gacy spending most of his time surrounded by the dead.
A number of serial killers will go through a variety of experiences which will mean that they come into close proximity with dead bodies. In Gacy's case, we know that he acted as a janitor in a mortuary. We have a kind of familiarization with dead bodies, a familiarization that would take away the taboo of being around a dead body.
After just 3 months, he returned to Chicago with the little money he had saved. In Chicago, Gacy enrolled in business college. For the first time, he began to succeed. He quickly discovered he was good at talking to people and had a natural talent for marketing. By the time he was 21, Gacy's business skills had earned him the role of manager at a shoe store. In September 1964, he met and married his co-worker, Marlon Myers. Marlon's father, impressed with Gacy, made him the manager of his 3 fast food franchises in Iowa. John and Marlon moved to Waterloo, where they started a family and had 2 children. Gacy became a family man, a rising star in business, and a respected figure in the community. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect life. What John Wayne Gacy would become shocked his suburban neighbors. After a childhood filled with illness and rejection, Gacy had a wife, 2 children, and a successful career as the manager of a fast food franchise. The Gacy family seemed like the perfect suburban family. But behind this respectable image, Gacy was living a life that was the complete opposite of what his neighbors believed.
Gacy was a role model. He was a role model of what a businessman should be. He should be involved in all of these political organizations, all of these business organizations. He should be the upstanding citizen in his small town. But it really had no meaning for him. Otherwise, if it had, he wouldn't have needed to go into the remainder of what he did for the rest of his life.
In 1967, Gacy lured 16-year-old John Tullery to his home. They watched pornographic movies, drank, and played pool. Then, without warning, Gacy forced Tullery onto a bed at knife point, handcuffed him, and started to choke him.
In the case of John Tullery, he followed the usual getting them drunk and showing pornography and then turning suddenly and using violence or threat, and in this case a knife, to force that person into handcuffs, into a power submissive role, and then to actually inflict torturous sexual behavior, taunting, choking, threats to that individual, who would, generally speaking, in many occasions, not report this.
Tullery reported the attack, and soon other boys came forward. Gacy was arrested, and the 26-year-old family man, once a well-respected member of his community, was charged with sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in Anamosa State Prison. There, Gacy befriended fellow inmate Ray Cornell, a convicted sex offender. Although Gacy should have been a prime target in prison due to his crimes, he kept his true nature hidden and adapted quickly. His ambition, which had propelled him in the outside world, remained strong, but this time he was aiming to be a pillar of a very different community. Richard Snavely, a prison counselor, would later come into contact with Gacy during his time there.
And you're a man of some authority here. What is your title?
Well, I'm first cook in the kitchen, and I run the morning meal and the afternoon meal in the kitchen.
John, how long have you been here?
I've been here now a year and about 2 weeks.
He kind of got himself ingratiated into the system. He was very responsible. He was able to try to develop a position, and he was pretty successful in doing that.
However, Ray Cornell witnessed another side of John Wayne Gacy during an encounter with an openly gay convict known as Mr. Connect.
Mr. Connect and some of his friends were in the lower yard of the prison playing basketball, and the ball got loose and went rolling past John.
And John got the ball and threw it as hard as he could, and Connect, not showing a lot of good judgment, then said, missed me, now you gotta kiss me." And John went after him.
Missed me, now you gotta kiss me." And John went after him.
Just for a second, I think I saw just a glimpse of what his victims saw at the end of their lives, because he had every intention of going after Gary Connect and hurting him badly or killing him.
I think I saw the monster.
At Christmas in 1969, Gacy received news that would deeply affect him. His father had passed away from cirrhosis, and the authorities denied his request to attend the funeral.
He requested permission to visit his father and I suppose make amends with him. My suspicion is that when his father died, that was difficult, because what it means is that you can never repair this relationship. People always want the approval of their parents, no matter how old they are.
He talked about his father over the next several days, and he also talked about how deeply hurt he was at the fact that he would not be going over to Chicago to see his father buried.
By 1970, less than 2 years after his conviction, Gacy's good behavior in prison led to his early release, although he had been sentenced to 10 years.
He's released very quickly. His sentence was 10 years. He was out after 18 months. He was able to convince people that his behavior wouldn't be repeated.
Now divorced from his wife Marlyn, who had filed for divorce on the grounds of cruel and inhuman treatment. Following his conviction for sodomy, Gacy returned to Chicago and settled in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Norwood. Leaving his past in Iowa behind, he continued to strive to be seen as an important member of the local community. He married Carol Hoff, a divorcee, and she, along with her 2 children, moved into his home.
Beginning to become invulnerable, that he could rise again, and simply getting married was just another strategic plan as far as Gacy was concerned. There was no real sexual intent in this marriage, it was convenience.
Just like in Iowa, Gacy's image as the perfect suburban neighbor was nothing more than a facade. In 1971, he was again reported for disorderly conduct by Chicago police after a teenage boy accused him of picking him up at a bus station and forcing him to perform a sexual act. The case was dropped when the boy failed to appear in court. In 1972, Gacy was charged with assault after a young man accused him of forcing him to perform oral sex, claiming Gacy had told him he was a sheriff's deputy. The case never went to trial.
He primarily used the guise of being a police officer. John was into the police thing. He had a Chicago police star.
Timothy Jack McCoy was only 15 years old when Gacy picked him up at a Chicago bus station in 1972. After spending the night together, Gacy stabbed him to death. Gacy later claimed the killing was an accident and that he acted in self-defense.
He was killed in the house in self-defense.
And who killed him then?
I stabbed him.
Yeah, and it was an issue of self-defense. Why was he in the process of assaulting you, or what?
He was coming at me with a knife. I just took the knife away and twisted it in his hand, and that's what killed him.
This was Gacy's first murder, and it would not be his last. Gacy was never arrested for the murder of the teenager. To the outside world, the 15-year-old had simply vanished. And to the local community, John Wayne Gacy appeared to be the perfect suburban neighbor.
The neighbors on the block liked him. He was a very friendly man.
He would give these tremendous outside parties for 100 to 200 people.
Gacy often entertained his neighbors by dressing up as a clown and performing magic tricks.
I remember one time I went with him in his full clown makeup and everything, and passing out balloons and taking pictures with the kids and having a good time doing some clown tricks and stuff.
Not knowing how evil he was, you would like to have him in your community. He was active in the JCs, which is the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and he was a volunteer for the political party of his choice, and he was very well thought of in the very small world of his community.
In 1974, Gacy started his own painting, decorating, and construction business, hiring several young men to do the work. His charisma and confidence made sure there was never a shortage of potential employees. Gacy's image as a good neighbor and successful businessman kept his true reasons for hiring the young men a secret.
John Wayne Gacy, he was a big name in town, and when he walked in, he was John. He had the big car outside. He had the money. Everybody knew he was wealthy. He had a big business, and when he approached boys that were 14, 15, 16 years old, making minimum wage, and he was promising them almost double salary just to work in a construction site and help him build. These boys jumped at the chance.
By the mid-70s, Gacy's wife started to complain about his violent mood swings. He had lost interest in sex and was keeping gay pornography around the house. She divorced him and moved out. Gacy began to drive around Chicago, searching for young men in gay districts and known hangouts where vulnerable people would gather. In 1975, young men began disappearing. Some were involved in selling sex on the streets, while others were runaways. Some were even connected to his construction business. These young men were often drugged, handcuffed, and subjected to repeated sexual assaults and brutal torture. Eventually, they were strangled.
Gacy was able to actually use one of his roles, that of a pseudo-police officer. He had the wherewithal in terms of, a radio, and he would often hide behind a badge and have, bits of what looked like police paraphernalia.
He would pick them up here, cruising the streets in a car that had a very large light on it, as the police often did, and he would be able to stop people using that as if he were a police officer, picking up strays, taking them home, torturing them.
Rumors spread within the gay community about the dangers of a large man with a taste for violent, sadistic sex. Despite an increasing number of young men disappearing, they were assumed to have left town or run away. With no bodies found, the disappearances were dismissed as just another set of missing persons cases in a city that reported thousands each year.
The police tend to call young kids of that kind blue dross. They tend to call them that as a way of saying they don't matter as much as kids from a normal background, so we don't give them as much attention. We also know, because of their sexuality, that often that means the police don't take enough notice of the violence in gay men's lives.
Even when police were made aware of Gacy's disturbing behavior, they failed to act. In March 1978, 27-year-old Geoffrey Rignall was lured into Gacy's car with an offer to share a joint. He was chloroformed, driven to Gacy's house, and subjected to hours of sexual torture.
I got in the car with him, and shortly after I got in the car with him, he placed a rag over my face, of which turned out to be chloroform, and proceeded to have a lengthy drive, and every time I would come to, the rag would go back over my face, and I remember him carrying me into his house, and then he put the rag over me, and that's the last thing I remembered until I found myself about 5:30 in the morning on the steps right by Lincoln Park, half dressed, my face completely burned.
After being repeatedly drugged, Geoffrey Rignall regained consciousness beneath a statue in Chicago's Lincoln Park. Despite reporting the assault to the police, Gacy remained free, and his violent actions continued unchecked. But in his arrogance, John Wayne Gacy was about to make a fatal mistake. In December 1978, a 15-year-old boy disappeared, one of many missing in the Chicago area. But this case was different. The boy was Rob Piest, a 15-year-old high school student who worked part-time at Nissan Pharmacy in the northwestern suburbs. On December 11th, after his shift, he told his mother he was going to meet a man about a construction job. Rob Piest never came home. His parents, worried, went to the police to report their son as missing. At that time, the man in charge of the state's attorney's office was Terry Sullivan.
A couple that was here last night reporting their son missing, and I think there's something strange to it. I don't believe that he's a runaway.
Sullivan agreed to investigate. Rob Piest was the picture of a good kid devoted to his family, an honors student with dreams of becoming an astronaut. There was no reason for him to run away. Something was terribly wrong. A search was quickly organized. His parents were devastated and uncertain about what had happened to their son.
Went to pick up Rob at the drugstore where he works at about 10 to 9. And he says it would take a few minutes, that he wanted to talk to this contractor about a job. And then with that, I started browsing around the store, and I'd never seen him since.
For the police, the most obvious lead was the contractor Rob had planned to meet John Gacy. It was soon discovered that Gacy had a history of hiring young men. 2 days after Rob's disappearance, Terry Sullivan brought Gacy in for questioning.
And he basically just said he had no idea what we were talking about. He denied even knowing the kid, and in frustration, I had said to him that, well, I understand that you don't want to say anything, but we've got evidence that, in fact, you were seen with him.
However, at that time, there was no direct evidence linking Gacy to Rob's disappearance. Gacy denied any involvement, and with no body or physical proof, the police had no grounds to detain him. By mid-December 1978, police began tracking Gacy's movements. A background check revealed that Gacy had been convicted 10 years earlier in Iowa for sodomy involving a teenage boy. Gacy had served just 18 months at the Iowa Men's Reformatory before being released. Given his criminal history, the police placed Gacy under 24-hour surveillance, but at that point, they still lacked the concrete evidence they needed to arrest him. David Hackmeister, a 6-year veteran of the department and a father of 3, was assigned to the case.
I knew that, in fact, they thought that this could be a homicide. They asked me to keep surveillance on the house.
It quickly became clear that undercover surveillance of John Gacy would be nearly impossible. He frequently sped through city streets at over 60 miles per hour. Over several days, frustration grew as 2 teams of officers, working in pairs, followed Gacy on fruitless journeys across metropolitan Chicago. Meanwhile, Rob Piest's family continued their desperate search, posting his picture throughout the neighborhood. Then, a new lead emerged. During the surveillance, Gacy casually mentioned that he owned land up north in Wisconsin. Although it seemed like a simple remark, this statement raised suspicion and became a key lead, prompting the police to investigate further.
Of course, he's feeding us this information knowing that we're going to follow up on this, just kind of leading us off the track.
Gacy may have intentionally mentioned the land to mislead investigators and divert their attention from his home, where he was hiding his victims. His hope was that the authorities would focus on this unverified lead, buying him time to cover up his horrific crimes. Work at the state's attorney's office soon became more productive. Investigators secured a search warrant for Gacy's home based on his prior conviction for sodomy in Iowa.
My hopes, of course the hopes of the police officers and my fellow state's attorneys, was that we would find Rob alive.
When they entered Gacy's house, it was meticulously neat. They collected various items including handcuffs and garter belts. One officer also found a photo receipt from Nissan Pharmacy, the same place where Robert Piest worked part-time. Among the items discovered in Gacy's home, one stood out as particularly chilling: a class ring. The ring was traced to John Zick, a recent high school graduate who, like Rob Piest, was missing. This discovery was just the beginning. Interviews with Gacy's acquaintances revealed that 2 of his employees, Gregory Godzik and Johnny Bukovich, both 17 years old, had also disappeared. They hadn't been heard from in over 2 years. An unmistakable pattern began to emerge, linking Gacy to the missing boys. What had once seemed like a trickle of cases quickly turned into a flood of disturbing evidence. Then, investigators received 2 crucial breaks. First, a fellow employee of Rob Piest came forward, revealing that she had placed the photo receipt in Piest's jacket. The receipt, found in Gacy's house, became a critical link, confirming that Gacy had met with Rob the night he disappeared. But there was more. Interviews with Gacy's employees revealed that he had asked them to dig trenches for new plumbing in the crawl space beneath his house. This new information sparked a memory for a detective who had once used the bathroom at Gacy's house.
And it's cold winter, and the furnace came up from bringing the fumes up from downstairs. Now, being an experienced homicide detective, and Detective Schultz came back and said that he recognized the odor of bodies decaying.
The idea of bodies hidden in the basement was a horrifying thought that haunted the detectives. Some had even spent hours in Gacy's home, just above the basement, in the rec room. Gacy had invited them inside for drinks, possibly out of arrogance, or perhaps to taunt them. With these new clues in hand, the detectives pushed for a second search warrant. Late on the evening of December 20th, they followed Gacy to his attorney's office. After spending the night on the couch at his attorney's office, Gacy was back on the move. The detectives, now exhausted after 8 days of surveillance, were closing in. Christmas was just 4 days away, but they finally believed Gacy was about to crack.
Absolutely certain that at this point there was a confession, because the attorneys were very, very, very nervous.
One of Gacy's first stops was the Shell gas station, where he was a regular customer.
At the gas station, I recovered some drugs that Gacy had given to these people as he was saying his last goodbyes.
When I got that information, I told them to take him down, to arrest him.
that was probably the closing of the news. We rushed the car at a stoplight, pulled Gacy out of the car, threw him up against the trunk of the car, and told him that he was under arrest for a drug violation.
By December 21st, just 10 days after Rob Pius disappeared, John Wayne Gacy was on his way to jail for a drug charge. While he was linked to several missing boys, no bodies had yet been found. As Gacy was led into the station, a second search of his home was about to begin. By the spring of 1992, Menard State Penitentiary in downstate Illinois had been Gacy's home for 13 years. By the time he agreed to a prison interview, he had an answer for everything. Even when questioned about the persistent odor from the crawl space, Gacy had an explanation.
You know, I found it as odd when we bought the house that a house with a crawl space would need a sump pump. But then I learned the first time it rained that this ground gets wet under there, and then the crawl space actually floods up to a foot deep in water. And then as it recedes, it puts out a musty odor. There was always a musty odor in that house.
When asked about the day in December 1978, when a detective believed he smelled decaying bodies, Gacy insisted it wasn't what they thought at all.
We had come into the house, and my little Lhasa Apso was in the house. And of course, he had been locked in the kitchen, you know, all day. Well, the little puppy, he piddles, see, and while he's piddling, and while he is doing his business on the paper and that, you can imagine what it smells like if you go into a closed room. And when the heat came...
Even now, it seems almost unbelievable that Gacy would rely on such a defense. The truth about the crawl space was revealed to the world on the very day Gacy was arrested. On the night of December 21st, 1978, while John Gacy was being held at the Des Plaines police station for possession of marijuana, the second search of his house began. As some officers searched upstairs for evidence, two detectives descended into the crawl space. Crawling on their hands and knees through the mud, they carefully surveyed the ground. One officer took a shovel, dug about 6 inches down, and pulled up something hard. It was a human bone. While Gacy was held at the local police station, complaining of chest pains, he was rushed to a nearby hospital. Detective David Hackmeister met him there.
I hadn't been there maybe 20 minutes or a half an hour when I got a phone call from my supervisor advising that they had found bones in the crawl space. At that time, Gacy was just being released from Holy Family Hospital, and I advised him at that point that he was under arrest for murder.
Defeated, Gacy looked straight at Hackmeister and said, "Dave, I'm ready to clear the air." He then confessed to the murder of more than 30 young men and boys.
He certainly held nothing back. He talked about the very first person that he killed, and that he had stabbed him to death, and that caused such a mess that he had to come up with another plan after that. Every person that he killed thereafter, he came up with a plan to strangle.
The specifics Gacy provided of torture in his house were staggering. He talked in detail about sexually abusing the boys and strangling them. As Gacy talked, the officers looked for some feeling in him, some emotion about what he had done. There was none.
In the confession room, I most clearly remember that there was no remorse. Very, very cold about it.
By the next day, word that bodies had been found at John Gacy's house had spread through the media. The Cook County medical examiner, Dr. Robert Stein, arrived and joined the crew to direct the exhuming of the bodies. First, they ripped out the floorboards of the house, exposing the crawl space completely. Some workers dug through the mud beneath the house. Others began to dismantle the garage. By midday, the first body bag emerged. The crew pressed on. A second body was carried out shortly after. On that first day, a ritual was established that would last as long as the digging continued. Each afternoon, Dr. Stein would report the discoveries of the day.
In the garage, there was just one skeletalized remain, and in the house itself also a skeletalized remain.
No one knew how many bodies would eventually be found. But based on Gacy's confession, officials speculated that the number would be considerable.
When this whole thing is over, you might be witnessing one of the most horrible crimes, perhaps, in a century.
Early on, investigators brought in the one person who could provide the most help, John Gacy. He showed them one spot to check and then was quickly whisked away. Gacy's information about the graveyard beneath his house was remarkably precise. At one point, he even drew a sketch of the crawl space.
It's a bone-chilling little handwritten sketch because this guy knew where almost every body was. He didn't remember the names of them, or he wouldn't tell us the names, but he knew where they were in the basement.
All 6 bodies were essentially skeletalized.
For the workers in the crawl space, the task was unbearable. Every time they dug a hole, it would quickly fill with water, and they had to sift through the mud by hand, picking out small bones. When a skull was found, a stake was placed into the ground with an identifying number. Outside, in the freezing cold, among the spectators was veteran crime reporter John Drummond.
It attracted the curious, despite the cold weather. People would come out there to see the scene because what had this scene ever happened before? No. The odor was terrible. All the investigators that we talked to afterwards admitted that the stench, despite the fact it was very cold weather, was overwhelming. It was terrible, and the smell of death was everywhere as they went in.
Some people didn't come just out of curiosity. They were the relatives of young men who had been missing for years, hoping to finally uncover the truth.
I just have a grandson missing, and it's just a stab in the dark.
The number of bodies found today are 6.
Bringing the total to?
21.
As the search neared its end, the Gacy house was completely dismantled. 29 bodies had been unearthed, but still, there was no sign of Rob P.S., the young boy whose disappearance had set the investigation in motion. The search for Rob would continue. But the question on many people's minds was, where was Rob's body? After all, it was his disappearance that had brought the police to Gacy's door. This question haunted the investigators and the public. At the same time, another question weighed heavily on everyone's minds. How had John Gacy gotten away with killing so many young men and boys for so many years, all behind the mask of the killer clown? John Gacy's public persona never changed until the day the bodies were found, and Gacy's real story became a national news sensation, shocking even veteran crime reporters. It was later revealed that Gacy had started burying his victims' bodies under his house as early as 1972. By 1978, he believed the crawl space was full, and he sought out other ways to dispose of his victims' bodies. After his arrest, Gacy led the police to a bridge over the Des Plaines River, where they recovered 4 more bodies. The final body, discovered in the spring, was that of Rob P.S., the young boy whose disappearance had first led investigators to Gacy.
Believe me, if Rob Piest had been anyone but Rob Piest, if he had been a person that had run away on several occasions, we probably wouldn't have looked into it as closely as we had.
In April 1979, John Gacy was officially indicted for the murder of 33 young men and boys, the largest number of murders ever charged to a single person in U.S. history. Gacy's method of luring victims will be explored when we continue on Crime Stories. During his 1992 prison interview, the most chilling statements Gacy made were about his victims and their families. His contempt for them was undeniable.
One mother that gets on television all the time who thinks I should be given 33 injections. I think she ought to take 33 Valiums and go lay down. She goes on Geraldo show and all these other shows talking about, I think it's Maori, I think is the name, her Marine son. Her Marine son, if her Marine son was so great, what the hell did he run away from home 12 times?
From the very beginning, Gacy's victims were referred to by numbers, simply representing the order in which they had been found. Once recovered from the crawl space, the bodies were taken to the county morgue, where the real work began, identifying each body and giving a name to the numbers. The first body identified was 17-year-old Johnny Bukovich, one of the boys who had worked for Gacy. The second was Greg Godzik, also an employee. As each name was announced, news crews rushed to locate the families.
He was a good boy. I'd spend anything to find him. I really would. And I think every mother would. It's just not me. I'm sorry for everybody else.
Daryl Sampson, John Zick, Randall Raffet, these faces soon filled the newspapers. Body number 13 was identified as Johnny Mowry, 19 years old, a former Marine. His mother, Dolores Nieder, last saw Johnny on September 15, 1977.
We would go out searching for him. We were playing detectives. We were searching for Johnny, looking for him. And already, Johnny was dead.
Dolores had gone to the police to report her son missing, but they were unhelpful, dismissing her concerns.
He said no. He said, Johnny's a runaway. Oh, I was shocked when I heard that. I said, what has Johnny got to run away from?
The same was true for all the other missing boys. Not a single parent's concerns were taken seriously. For years, some police officers unknowingly played directly into Gacy's hands.
And what he said to us, nothing wrong with Johnny. Johnny is not dead.
What made
He's
you...
missing. That's all what he say. He's run away. And I know right away it's not true. Because Johnny no got no reason to run away. If they listen to us, they save so many lives.
While the police labeled the missing boys as runaways, Gacy claimed they were all homosexual predators.
The biggest excuse that he came up with is that all of the victims made him do what he did. It was the victim's fault. If they hadn't pursued him, he wouldn't have had to do to them what he did.
But as investigators uncovered the identities of the victims, it became painfully clear that the majority were neither runaways nor male prostitutes.
Gacy had said they were gay. Johnny, I know, was not gay, but even if he was, no one has a right to take anyone's life.
They were innocent young men, lured into Gacy's trap. As more bodies were identified, the list of names grew: William Carroll, Robert Gilroy, Russell Nelson. They were all young, healthy, and strong. The question remained, how had Gacy managed to overpower these boys? The answer lay in his cunning and his perfect ploy. Driving his black car, equipped with 2 spotlights, Gacy would pretend to be a policeman. He would stop a young man walking down the street, flash a badge, and order him to get in the car. Once inside, the boys were driven straight to Gacy's home. There, he used his next trick to ensure his victim's compliance. He explained how it worked with his last victim, Rob Piest.
It's a very simple trick. He says, I'll show you how to do it. Put the handcuffs on. So he had Rob Piest actually put the handcuffs on himself and cuff himself behind his back. And Rob struggled with the handcuffs for several minutes and said, well, what's the trick here? And John reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the key to the handcuffs and said, the trick is you have to have the key.
Once the boys were restrained in handcuffs, Gacy moved to his next horrifying trick. He would slip a rope over the victim's neck and twist a rod through it over and over until the young man collapsed. For the parents who later learned the horrific details of their children's final moments, the image was simply devastating.
I could never forgive Gacy for the rest of my life. How on earth can you forgive someone who takes a loving child from you and who does it in such, a tragic way?
Over the course of 6 years, John Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys, all while evading capture. It wasn't until the police finally began to listen to the parents of one missing child that Gacy's reign of terror came to an end. In the spring, 4 months after his disappearance, Rob Piest, the boy whose case had ultimately led to Gacy's capture, was laid to rest. 9 other boys murdered by Gacy were never identified, and their bodies were buried in separate cemeteries across Chicago. While these young victims have now been properly laid to rest, the pain for their families remains as fresh and raw as ever. As John Gacy spoke from prison in 1992, he made it very clear that he was tired of being associated with other famous serial killers, especially the man who killed and then consumed his victims, Jeffrey Dahmer.
I'll tell you this, that's a good example as to why insanity doesn't belong in the courtroom. Because if Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't meet the requirements for insanity, then I'd hate like hell to run into the guy that does.
It is an ironic statement, coming from a man who 13 years before had pled not guilty to 33 murders, using the defense of insanity. On February 6, 1980, the first day of John Gacy's trial, people lined up at the criminal court building in Chicago, eager to get a glimpse of one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. Already, Gacy's story had received so much press coverage in Chicago that jurors had to be selected from Rockford, a city 50 miles north. The 16 men and women were bused to the courthouse and sequestered for the entire 6-week-long trial. Gacy was pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, and at first it seemed the defense had an advantage. The judge was Louis Garipeau.
If you really think about it, if the defense is insanity, and you have someone who's killed 33 people, everyone say, hey, there must be something wrong with that person. And I believe that in most, more than half of the jurors that were selected felt that there was something mentally wrong with John Gacy.
In their opening statements, attorneys for the prosecution argued that Gacy was evil. They displayed photographs of his victims on a board nicknamed the Gallery of Grief. They promised to show that the murders of the young men were thoughtful, rational, and premeditated. The defense described Gacy as impulsive, deranged, a profoundly sick man who collected bodies like souvenirs. The question the jury had to decide was Gacy crazy or evil. For the defense, a battery of experts testified that Gacy fit the standard of insanity. One was forensic psychiatrist Helen Morrison.
He could commit an act, but it didn't mean that he sat and planned the act. It was almost as if he were an automaton doing this behavior, and once the behavior was done, he was finished.
The psychiatric experts offered varying opinions of Gacy's mental illness, borderline personality, paranoid schizophrenia, amnesia. But the prosecution believed the facts of the case were more important than the psychiatric testimony. If the murders were not premeditated, they asked, why would Gacy have burial trenches dug in advance? Why did he keep handcuffs and a rope ready? If he didn't understand the criminality of his behavior, why would he deliberately choose victims who might not be missed? If he had amnesia, how could he draw a precise sketch locating each body? William Kunkel was the chief prosecutor.
Clearly, when you have this kind of intentional behavior, the pre-planning for all those things, the covering up, the post-planning, the post-conduct for all those things, and all this going on in the backdrop of what on the surface appears to be a perfectly normal existence, just doesn't fit.
As the jury heard the testimony and looked at Gacy, they saw a man at ease and very much in control of himself.
Theory or the thought or the fantasy about someone who's insane is that they're running down the street screaming, pulling their hair out without clothes on. And they could clearly see that he was not insane. I mean, he was sitting in the courtroom, he was participating, smiling, being considerate of where people were sitting.
The jury also learned that Gacy ran a successful business, was involved in politics, and was active in his community. All rare accomplishments for someone truly mentally ill.
A real medical model psychiatrist that really treats patients and understands mental illness will never believe that you can turn this kind of serious mental illness off like a faucet. Did he have personality disorders? Absolutely. Was he a sexual deviant? Of course, but psychotic? Not even close.
Throughout the trial, Gacy remained confident, certain that he would win the case.
He'd been in the back and he was reading the Chicago Sun-Times and some of the ads in there. And he had torn out a page and he had circled a party, a St. Patrick's Day party, that was to be coming up. And he had the bailiff give it to me on the table and he said, I'll see you there.
But then, toward the end of the trial, there was testimony that the defense believed was a final blow against Gacy.
At that time, there was a psychiatrist who testified that if he was found insane, he would be put out on the street because he could not be hospitalized against his will. That, obviously, no one in their right mind believed that this man was sane, but no one was willing to take the chance that he would be out on the street.
The last dramatic argument came from William Kunkel.
I said to the jury, I said, well, if you want to show mercy, and then I just stopped in mid-sentence. I turned around and I walked over to the victim board, and real slow, I ripped each photo off the board with a loud snap. Take my time, about 2 minutes, to get all 22 off in my hand, and I walked back in front of the jury box right in their faces, and I said, look, if you want to show this man mercy, you show him the same mercy he showed when he took these 22 lives off the face of the earth and put them here. And I just threw them in the crawl space opening, walked away. I left a couple of minutes of pin-drop silence in the courtroom, and that was a good point.
The jury took only one vote and unanimously agreed to find John Gacy guilty of 33 counts of murder. The next day, they sentenced him to death. Throughout the many years he spent in prison, convicted serial killer John Gacy had little trouble keeping busy. He spent much of his time painting.
This is Christ as I see him in my cell. And it's monolithic because Christ to me is monolithic. He's all things to all people. This here is the Hi-Ho series. This is called Hi-Ho Around the Campfire.
Many who knew him there said Gacy actually enjoyed prison. He thrived on the regularity of life in an institution. Karen Conti was one of his appellate attorneys.
His life outside of prison was just completely filled with anxiety for him. He had options. He could kill, he could not kill. There was this good and bad that was a constant dilemma in his life. When he was in prison, all of that was removed. He had his life set up in a very orderly fashion.
If you want to know what my life is like, I log it every day. For the last 12 years, all you got to do is ask. I can tell you everything. I can tell you the first meal they served me here because I do it daily.
What do you do all day?
Every phone call, everything that I do, every time an officer's around me is logged. Every movement that I make is in the book here.
Filling the pages of Gacy's log were hundreds of hours spent with attorneys who were representing him in the appellate courts. As ardent opponents of the death penalty, working together, they had taken on one of the most unpopular cases in the country.
First of all, we got death threats. We had clients who quit us. We carried a baseball bat from the garage to the house after a while. We had bomb threats.
Dozens of legal issues were raised on behalf of Gacy, while he maintained that he was not the one who killed the boys in his basement.
At the time of my arrest, there was 4 other suspects, all employees of PDM contractors, all with keys to the house.
To the end, Gacy denied his guilt.
I wanted him to have this breakthrough. I wanted him to have this all of a sudden, all right, there's no more pretense, there are no more appeals. Now I can tell you I did it and this is why I did it. I was waiting for it, but it just never came. It was like a book with no ending.
As the years went by, each and every appeal was denied. At last, a final execution date was set, May 10th, 1994, 14 years after his conviction.
Nothing was going to delay the killing of John Gacy because the people were bound and determined that John Gacy was going to be killed.
Throughout the years on death row, Gacy claimed that he was not worried. He had no reason to fear the day he would die.
He would die.
If you believe you've lived your life the right way, then you do not have nothing to fear, in my case.
You're not worried about facing God?
No. I'm fairly comfortable with him. I've been at the Catholic services, I'm the server for the priest for the last 10 years. I have no qualms about doing that. I've had confession, I have communion, and I am at peace with myself.
On the morning of his execution, Gacy was flown from his downstate prison to the death chamber at Stateville Correctional Center.
We have attorneys on standby that will be available to the very end to fight any attempts to stay this execution.
By 7 that evening, the U.S. Supreme Court denied a last request for a stay of execution.
At the end, Gacy wanted to speak with each of the lawyers separately. He took me aside and he wanted to thank me for trying as hard as I could and for keeping him occupied with jokes and for being kind to him and calling him and keeping him informed.
Even while the crowds cheered outside his cell, Gacy did not believe he was going to die.
At about 11:15 on the night that Gacy was killed, one of us called up Gacy and said, "How are you doing?" And Gacy said, "You know what? Can this wait? Can I talk to you in a while?" We said, "No, John, I can't wait. I mean, what do you mean a while?" He said, "Call back in an hour or two." I said, "John, you're going to be dead in an hour or two. What are you thinking about?"
There was a candlelight vigil by opponents of the death penalty, but far more people clearly were in favor of his execution. Just after midnight, with relatives of his victims watching on a television in the prison basement, Gacy was strapped to a gurney in the execution room. He was given 3 lethal injections.
John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m.
He got a much easier death than any of his victims. In my opinion, he got an easier death than he deserved. But the important thing is that he paid for his crimes with his life.
A few months after Gacy's execution, a ceremony was organized. Relatives of the boys who were killed were invited to take a painting by Gacy and burn it. This symbolic act was an attempt to rid the world of the darkness that Gacy had left behind. For many, watching his artwork go up in flames was not just an act of defiance, but a moment of reclaiming their peace after years of unimaginable loss.